I'm Don Browning. I welcome you to this lecture by Amitai Etzioni. Amitai Etzioni is professor at the George Washington University. He has a long list of accomplishments. I'll hit the highlights. He's a former president of the American Sociological Society or Association, but this last decade, I think that he has become well known as the founder and the president of the Communitarian Network. It's a broad-based research and a communicative organization designed to further a conversation about how to balance rights and responsibilities and to affect public consciousness and public policy around these issues. And this has certainly been a movement that's had impact both in the United States and England and in other countries around the world. Dr. Etzioni goes around consulting with governments and leaders on a variety of issues from time to time. For several years, the Communitarian Network hosted the White House Conference on Character Education in cooperation, as the title suggests, with the White House. He's the author of several books, and if you have a copy of The Limits of Privacy, you can open the leaf and see the list of the several books that he has been the author of. I think you'll count as many as 11 books, and that's just the books that he has written, not the books that he has edited, and I imagine that that even leaves out a variety of books as well. The last copy of Responsive Community, which is a journal of the Communitarian Network, is a festschrift in the honor of Dr. Etzioni's 70th birthday. Shall we just be honest and say what it is? And there's a lot of good essays in here, and many of these essays cover all of his books, but often give special attention to his 1968 book entitled The Active Society. I made an observation about the attention that particular book got in driving around with Dr. Etzioni today, and he says, yes, that probably will be on my tombstone, that I am the author of The Active Society. Well, I thought that was a rather gruesome way of referring to how he would be remembered with regard to his accomplishments, but I'm going to add one more, but change the terminology a little bit. He is known and will be known for years to come as a person who believes in social movements, believes that social movements can be created. They are not just something to be studied, but actually created. Believe that social movements can be developed in such a way as to emerge out of creative dialogue and further creative dialogue. In addition to that, that social movements can have an intellectual foundation, and that in fact intellectuals can be involved in social movements. All these, I think, are distinctive with regard to his belief about the possibilities of social movements in our time. So I welcome you to hear Amitai Etzioni speak about his new book, his 11th book from the standpoint of the list that's in the back of the book, or the front of the book, The Limits of Privacy. Thank you very much for being here.
Well, thank you very much indeed for a very fine introduction. One of the joys of being in the Communitarian Project is to have distinguished colleagues like Professor Browning. In effect, if you do read this issue, you'll find a very fine article by him. So again, thank you for a very generous introduction. Let me also say with some embarrassment that despite that the introduction was extensive, I need to add one more detail. I hope it will not be considered too immodest. You'll see in a moment why. I got my sociological training in Jerusalem by one Martin Buber, and Buber convinced me that monologuing is not a way to exchange ideas. He believed in dialogue. So the part of this afternoon I'm looking very much forward to is when we can have a conversation, not just question and answers. Now, what I'm going to do is just say sufficiently provocative things so there be a basis for conversation. When you come to privacy, that's not terribly difficult. I'll start with a very simple example, but for me it includes all the elements of what we're going to be talking about. And here is the situation I'd like us to have in front of us as we're going to talk about privacy and the common good. Imagine you are working in an emergency room and somebody brings in a child who has burn marks on her arm, and on an X-ray it is revealed that several bones of this child were broken and they were healed over time, and we suspect that the child has been abused at home. We don't know that for a fact. What are we going to do? By law, what sounds right to us, but is right? We are going to violate the privacy of that home. You're going to send a social worker over there, maybe police, and we're going to ask a lot of privacy-violating questions. That reason I find that story so rich or pregnant is because it immediately alerts us to the fact that privacy is not an absolute value, that there are other things we are deeply concerned about, that our very important commitment to privacy, but our very important concern about the well-being of children and other common goods somehow need to be squared, and that leads to the next set of questions. Once we face such a tension, where do we go? Does it mean we're going to go into the home for flea bite? No. But where do we draw the line? By what principles are we going to guide our choices? Now, to get there, I'm going to visit three languages, three paradigms, if you wish, three social philosophies which will guide us how to address that question on a profound basis rather than on a kind of a ad hoc basis. The problem in doing so, especially surrounded with scholars and colleagues, is that each one of those camps is huge, and I could spend easily a semester just walking you through my libertarian friends and classical liberals and contemporary classical liberals and all those birds. And I can spend a much longer semester with the social conservative and various kinds of fundamentalists. And certainly, actually I do it every year, with the third camp, the communitarians. And like in all philosophies, there are different people who take somewhat different positions. In fact, many of them take different positions in their own writing. You know, John Stuart Mills kept changing his mind. Adam Smith, the first Adam Smith and the second Adam Smith, have surprisingly little to do with each other. So I'm going to cut through all this, and you'll have to understand that I'm not trying to give you a full tour of these three camps. I'm just trying to make one point. So on one side over there, you have people I'm going to call individualists, because they make the person, the individual, the center of their philosophy. And that includes some of those I mentioned earlier, some form of classical liberals, people in art that called contemporary classical liberals, and libertarians, and laissez-faire conservatives, those who want to emphasize the right to a choice, the free market and such. They all basically have one story, that the famous story with the fairy tale Locke concocted, that we had free-formed people, persons, who knew their mind, rational beings, reasoned people, with their right in place, and they came from the forest, and one afternoon they met and decided to create a society. The importance of this sequence is, this is after all just a didactic device, nobody claims it really happened. The importance of that story is to emphasize that whatever happens later, whatever we consent to, whatever we form, is derivative, and that what it is at the foundation is the individual. The individualists do not oppose social order or some social arrangements. They just want to emphasize they have to be based on voluntary arrangements, on contracts, on things these people agreed to when they wanted to surrender liberty. But the legitimation, the justification lies in free individual freely consenting to these arrangements. It's over here, not to bring it down to privacy, that there's a very sharp line being drawn between the private realm and the public realm. The private realm is supposed to be as big as possible, but most important, in it, everybody is free to do what their values guide them to do. The most important contrast between this group and the communitarians is that communitarians talk about common understandings of the good, that there should be social formulations of the good. That's exactly what this group opposes. They say each person should form in their own mind what's right and wrong. And when it comes to the public sphere, aside from minimizing it and be based on consensus, values should not be there in the first place. That's why, let's take one, Bruce Ackerman says we should bracket our values when we enter the public sphere. Now, to play this for a moment against my example, there are already going to be a difficulty here. To the degree that the individualists met in the town meeting and agreed we should violate privacy for the sake of children, that will fit that model. But to the degree that it comes from tradition or for some values, I'll come back to this, from any other supernatural source, natural law, moral realism, certain kinds of ethics, they don't really fit, because the first thing we do here is we go into the private sphere, and there are certain things we say are virtues, and we want to see that they will not happen in the private sphere. We find that line too simple, too harshly drawn. By the way, that's one of the most important feminist critiques of this approach, because spousal abuse is, again, takes place in the home usually, and the notion that because it's in private, it's none of our public business is exactly what we are questioning here. When we go to the opposite extreme, and by the way, I should alert you to one thing I'm doing here. Usually the opposition in intellectual life and in discussions over the last 150 years has been between conservatives and liberals, but not liberals in the sense we used a moment ago, but the kind of Humphrey Como liberals, and not the classical liberals. And here, conservative usually meant the Milton Friedman people, because the debate has been on the market and the state and the market, ever since people started reading Karl Marx. I'm connecting to all this because I'm not interested at the moment in the balance between the market and the state. I'm interested in the place of social virtues, and the place of privacy as a contradiction to social virtues. And on that continuum, the laissez-faire conservatives go together with the other individualists. And there is something here very, very different. Social conservatives. These are the kind of people who have prefixed answers as virtuous. And above all, they have a very broad agenda, very extensive agenda, and they are willing to use the state to enforce what they are considering virtuous. It's easiest to see the farther out you go. So if you go to religious fundamentalists, I don't know, let's visit Iran for a moment, they have a very, very extensive public list as to what people ought to do, how often they're supposed to pray, what direction they're supposed to bow, how women are supposed to dress, what they're supposed to do after their period, when they're supposed to have sex, what they're supposed to eat. A very, very long list of which are what is considered virtuous, and a very great willingness to have moral squads patrol the streets and see to it that people cover themselves appropriately, pray 5 times a day, and whatever the agenda is. And again, so I want to make this an Islamic issue. Those of you familiar with Orthodox Judaism, the list is equally long, and the willingness to enforce by the use of state is equally strong. And of course, in a much more moderate way, some of our social conservatives who, let's say, want to ban abortion, who want to ban divorce, who want to mandate prayers in school, who want to drive homosexuals out of town, are basically, again, are not willing to rely only on persuasion, but are quite ready to use the state to back up a long list of values they believe in. If here private is sacred, here private is all too indistinguishable from the public sphere, or at least the distinction are greatly minimized. The communitarian group finds itself, at least the way I see it, and again, to emphasize just the way there are huge differences in each camp. There are no two communitarians, all 10 of us, who will say exactly the same thing. But the communitarian position is that there is a list of core values, a limited list, not a very extensive list, of things which we do share as a community and which we seek to foster, and we do not want to leave to each individual to make their own decisions about it, but we hope to foster those values through education, convincing people, so something I'm going to call in a moment the moral voice, and when all else fails, under some carefully limited conditions, the government may need to step in. So if the contrast is here, privacy is very much cherished, and there is a great objection to socially defined virtues. Here there's a great willingness to have long lists of social virtues and enforce them quite readily by the use of state, and the communitarian, in effect, are somewhere in the middle. One word about social virtues. The term needs to be somewhat clarified. I deliberately use the word social virtues rather than simply virtues. Why? Because if you talk to my colleagues at the individualistic end, they say, oh, no, we are in favor of virtues. But if you listen to their virtues, they are individual virtues. So, for instance, they want people to be critical thinkers. And if you listen to Amy Gutmann and the whole debate about the Amish and the education, they say, oh, people have to be able to think critically. And they're willing suddenly to bring the state to ensure that people have these capacities to be good liberals. But they're not willing to enforce on them or push on them or foster on them the kind of things which we are much more communal. To give an example of what I consider a social virtue, as distinct from an individual virtue which resides in each person, the easiest for me, the least controversial, I think, is our stewardship to the environment. I think most Americans now feel that we have a moral obligation to Mother Earth. We differ exactly what it contains, but very few people want to go back to the 1950s where we paid no mind to the environment. An interesting indication that this is a shared virtue rather than one which individuals are free to take or leave is what happens in public schools. As you know, one of our strongest public stories is this doesn't happen necessarily in practice, but our public posture is that we should not teach values in schools, in public schools, that that's going to lead to the left is afraid is going to lead to indoctrination, religious teaching, and the right is afraid this is going to lead to brainwashing and all kind of crazy liberal theories. And in effect, there's then a consensus between the right and the left that this should be taught in private schools or on Sunday at home, but not in public schools. There's no such misgivings about drilling into kids the importance of environment, the virtue of environment. Those of you who have children, or if you go and visit the school, you see they are very, very strongly convincing the children that the environment, we owe the environment. Why? Because it's basically not an uncontested social virtue. Basically, my argument is that the list is a little longer than the environment. Now, I'm in a moment going to ask the question of balance. When do we know that the virtue has the standing which allows us, compels us to introduce it into the private sphere, and when not? But I need two more steps. First, I discovered, I'm by training a sociologist, and I keep invading other people's field, and they're not always completely happy about that. And one of the terms which I use, and at least raise some eyebrows sometimes, is something I call the moral voice. Now, to explain that quickly, here is the underlying assumption of human nature which this entails. My assumption is that people are born not good per se. Forget for a moment all the religious overtones of that. They happen to be very appropriate. But just think about technically. If a child is born, and if we have cases, and nobody will introduce values to this child, it will grow up uncivilized. They will, basically, even to walk erect is a taught skill, and certainly communicating values. So they call on foreign bark, basically, if you have evidence. It's not myth. So children are born without values. The society introduces them to values. Then later they may rebel or change them. But they grow up with this animal base. The thing which at least some of my more progressive colleagues have a hard time with, that even if you're brought up perfectly in this dream family, whatever that is, in a fantastic school, private school, and in a perfect neighborhood, you're still not a good person. There's no way we can extinguish animal instincts in us. We all end up having some sexually inappropriate or aggressive or some other feelings which cannot be extinguished. I used to say that the only people who don't hear two voices, one is what they ought to do, and the other is what they want to do, and feel that tension between, if you wish, their conscience and their urges, are a psychopath who hear only one voice, what they want to do, and saints who hear only what they ought to do. And then people corrected me and said that saints also sometimes are tempted. And so there's only one group who doesn't hear both voices. And the rest of us lead a difficult life between what we ought to do and what we want to do. A very simple sentence, I'll get to privacy in a moment, which has it all in it, is I ought to visit my friend in the hospital, but I would like to go to a movie. And that's really, I think, the human fate where we are. The moral voice comes and makes us better than we would be otherwise. It comes from the community and urges us to do what's right and chides us when we do what is wrong. It does not put guns at our heads. It, in the end, leaves the choice to us. But it speaks to us in the name of the community. It appreciates when we do what's right and chides us when we do what's wrong. And here we come to a major problem, which I leave to the question and answer or to another day. How do we know that the community chose the right values? I'm going to have to skip to it because otherwise I won't get to privacy. But there is a complicated answer. Now, if you rely on the moral voice, to at least to the extent possible, to encourage people to be better than they would be otherwise, we come to the importance of the village. In effect, my article about Clinton is called "It Takes a Village to Prevent an Indecent Act." And my point is like this. When we know what people do in a good community, that becomes a major deterrent against them doing things we would think are morally inappropriate. To make it less abstract and really to move on, let me give you an example where we don't have this Kenneth Starr business and grand juries and all that stuff. The press reported about Vice President Gore that last year he gave a very small amount to charity. That's a violation of his privacy, nothing to do with his public office. And you know what? I'm willing to lay a very hefty bet, let's say for another charity, that next year he's going to give more to charity. And there are scores and scores of politicians who call their accountants and say, be absolutely sure that we give enough to charity this year. That dynamics is what I'm talking about. There was no investigation, there's no inspectors, FBI agents, police involved. We make something visible of which we morally disapprove, in this case not being charitable, and it often, not always, but it does part of the business of keeping people where we think they ought to be. In effect, to put it more strongly, the more we have the moral voice of the community, the less we need to rely on the state. There's an inverse relationship between violation of privacy, which is entailed here, and keeping the government at bay. It's often said, more government, less privacy. I say less privacy, less government, because we can withdraw then more heavily on the social fabric. Now to the point of balance. When do we suggest the time is right for us to insert ourselves into the private space, as with the example of the child, and when we consider we ought not to do so? On the contrary, when we think we have intruded too far and we should retreat. To answer this question, I'm going to use in a moment 3 criteria which help me guide my thinking in this area. But let me first explain the reason why we need here very specific markers. It's an issue which appears both in religious tradition and in constitutional thinking. And that is the argument which you'll hear very, very often about the danger of the slippery slope. And people often argue that certain specific measures which there would not have, certain interventions, certain violation of privacy, which they wouldn't cherish in their own right, they particularly worry that once you go down that road, we're going to end up destroying our whole protection of privacy. And, you know, in Catholicism, that argument came up every time a change was made, going from that to the vernacular, or changing the place the priest looks and stands. In Judaism, having men and women sit together. It's an issue comes up every time there is a change made in tradition. In constitutional law, that's a major, major issue. That's one of the reasons people want to go back to the original intent, to the text, because once we say that the Constitution is a living document which can be changed, why not change it some more, and everybody starts editing it. So the whole power of tradition is at least the pretension that it's non-changing. And so when we think about Thanksgiving, we don't realize that it was moved around 16 times and it meant something very differently. We think it was always the way we have it. People always ate turkey and the women always cooked it, you know, and so on. So. Now, they fear that traditions, if they're religious, ethical, legal, may unravel once we start tampering them is a very real one. And I think should not be taken lightly. In effect, I could find cases where that happened historically. My answer to that is a double one. First, every time you hear somebody making the slippery slope argument, ask them, well, what would they do? Would they make no changes, just live the way we lived before, forever, never move, never change anything, out of the fear that once we stepped on the slope, we're going to end up on our backside at the wrong end? Let me just give it a very specific example. We argued that a violation of privacy in the case of drug use, mandatory testing for drugs, is justified for people who directly have the life of others in their hands. People drive school buses, people who pilots, police, but not others. Now, the civil libertarians tend to argue that, well, once you start testing people, tomorrow you're going to test athletes because they make pyramids, you know, and then the Weather Bureau, and soon everybody in the kindergarten. But that's why we need clear markers. We need to terrace the slope, make notches in it, so we can move, we don't have to freeze, and without facing the danger of ending up at the other end. Let me just say, as a digression, the right to privacy is far from one of those sacred rights which existed forever and has been never edited or changed. So changing it one more time would be hardly by itself break this tradition. As I guess most of you know, until 1890, the notion of privacy existed as a very informal cultural notion, but had no legal standing by itself. It is not as much as mentioned in the Constitution. In some court cases, privacy was treated as a property issue. Somebody took your diary and read it, and it's not that they invaded your privacy, they took away your property, and that was an issue. Then in 1890, Mrs. Warren had some gossip published about her in the newspaper, and she complained bitterly to Mr. Warren, the judge, and said, do something about it. So he got together with Mr. Brandeis, I may have heard about him, and they together wrote the most famous law review article ever written in the Harvard Law Review called The Right to Privacy, which published in 1890, and for the first time created the foundation for a legal right to privacy in our relationship to one another. We can, as a tort, we can sue each other for damage. But as a constitutional right, privacy is very recent vintage. It was created 34 years ago, and I'll come back to it later, in a very peculiar manner, which reflects the need of the time. So thinking about a new definition of the right to privacy is by no means breaks with history or the way these things are done. So here's the criteria I would use to ask the question, do we need to make changes in the balance between individual rights and common good? But I want to emphasize that you don't get to that question at all unless you use the right kind of language or social philosophy. One that does not say a right is sacred, trumps, is untouchable, everything else, the burden on proof is on anybody who wants to in any way make a dent on it. The whole space belongs to the right, and if you want to invade it, you show me why, and then I'll make you go to something the lawyers called high scrutiny, or translate, I'm going to make you jump to 3 hoops, and if you jump them, I'll bring you a 4th one. So you will not get to the question of balance that way. No, if you take the opposite position, that law and order is what matters, and everything else should take a second seat. You should start, from my viewpoint, beginning with the following recognition, that it's part of the human fate that we have values which are not completely compatible. It's not given to us to have one principle, liberty or any other, by which we can order our life. That there are multiple values we hold dear. Privacy is very, very important among them. A society cannot long remain free without privacy. But the well-being of children is another one, and public safety is another one, and public health is another one, and there's still more. And therefore, the big conversation begins with the question, we have multiple values, now what? Rather than saying, I have a Trump and everybody else should go home. Now, once you accept that way of thinking, then you come to the question, is there an imbalance because we don't want to tamper with tradition unnecessarily? I'm talking about real issues staring you in your face. I served a year in the Carter White House, and at least once a week somebody came and said, there's a terrible problem, Mr. President, let's change the country. Killer bees are coming from Mexico. And they wanted to make all kinds of things, you know. And I would not want to change our law, our traditions, our policies, unless there's a really compelling reason. HIV in Africa is a compelling reason. Terrorism might be. And we can argue what is and what is not, but not about, in my judgment, about the need to do this kind of testing. The second criteria is that we cannot solve the problem we did uncover without changing our traditions. So, for instance, people are concerned about teenagers smoking, and some people want to ban advertising. That raises First Amendment freedom of speech issues. I would prefer to raise taxes on cigarettes, because that doesn't raise any constitutional or ethical issues. Actually, it's at least as effective. And if we exhaust that remedy and we still don't do what it's doing, then we may want to look at other things. So the second criteria is, can we solve that problem, which we discovered as a serious one, in some other manner? If that does not work, then I would come to the third criteria. We would like the intrusion to be as minimally as possible. Now, let me take 2 cases, and to save time, and walk you how that looks like when we talk about the balance between public health, public safety, and privacy. Now, in all 50 states, by law, when a child is born, we take a few drops of blood from the heel of the child, and we test it for a genetic illness which is called PKU. PKU is, if left untreated, causes severe retardation of the child. If the parents give it an appropriate diet, the child will grow up fine. So there is no debate about it. I never heard anybody debating about it. There are no consent forms. There's no discussion of privacy. We just go Every child born in the United States, in all 50 states, take the blood. And I see we're going to have a discussion about that. And that is part of state law. Fine. So there's no debate about it. I never heard anybody debating about it. There are no consent forms. There's no discussion of privacy. We just go. Every child born in the United States, in all 50 states, take the blood. And I see we're going to have a discussion about that. And that is part of state law, but I'll read the chapter and verse. And we then tell the mother that the child, or the father and both, that the child needs treatment. We used to take the same blood and also test it for HIV and use information basically for statistical purposes as a way of tracking the spread of the illness. And if that was justified or not telling the mother in those days is a all separate question I don't need to go into. But the new medical findings are, and they are incontestable, that if the mother will do two things, not breastfeed the child and give it AZT shortly after birth, the child has a good chance, not 100%, but a good chance of throwing off this terrible illness. I'm not talking about ameliorating the life of somebody who has HIV, which we often do, you know, for adults, but throwing off this illness, lead a normal life. If she will breastfeed it, it's sure to get HIV from the breastfeeding and is going to die. Now, the problem is that when we test the infant, we in effect finding out about the mother. The infant didn't have intercourse or exchange needles. It got the illness from the mother, and we're clearly violating her privacy and autonomy when we then come and tell her she didn't ask, she didn't necessarily want to know. About 60% of the mothers do not know. Now, when that issue came up, and that's very recent, in the last 2-3 years, a fierce debate started between those who felt that we must tell the mothers because the life of the child is at stake, and those who felt, for very compelling reason of their own, that this is not acceptable. They felt that these are people, there's often drug users, these people come from populations which are already disadvantaged, already discriminated against, that they may lose their jobs, their housing, their insurance if become known for the HIV, that we violate their basic rights in doing so, and that there's a better way of doing it, my number 2. That if you catch pregnant women early, if you give them as part of prenatal care, ask them, counsel them, advise them to take an HIV test, you would take the test and then you can tell them what to do and we won't face any of these constitutional issues. Do it voluntarily. And I'm all in favor of this approach. In fact, we should do much more of it. There are 2 catches. First of all, sadly, it's effective. Whatever we do, some mothers, we don't find that way. We have a hard time getting them all to come to prenatal care. Worse, if you're tested for HIV on Monday and you exchange needles on Tuesday, you're exposed again. So I would have to test you again and again and again the day before delivery in order to do it that way, and just nobody does that. And so we come to number 3. In my judgment, and I feel under those circumstances, the well-being of the child needs to take priority over the privacy of the mother. We should counsel the mothers. We should increase the penalties on disclosure to third parties. There are many other things we need to do, but my analysis of this calls for, in this case, tilting in that way. You may disagree. My point is really, I didn't come here to discuss HIV testing of infants. I came to discuss how we think about these issues. That we don't stop by saying privacy is holy, everything else. That we say that we face here 2 very important issues. Privacy is very important to us, and the well-being of children. Now let's see how we go from here. That's the way of thinking I want to argue for. Let me say that only New York State, as we speak, allows disclosure to the mother. It's not disclosed in Illinois and any of the other neighboring states. And the CDC, who used to conduct these studies to get out of the controversy, stopped doing the test altogether. So nobody can charge them if it's not disclosing because they no longer do the test. You give them whatever moral points you want for that. Now, among the other things I studied, some of them, the balance is much less clear. Let me just mention two more and come to my conclusion. You hear in the press very often, and for good measure, that new technologies are coming up all the time which violate your privacy. People listening on your cell phone. When you go to some of the toll booths, the easy cards, they keep track on your movement. Employers read your email. All this is true. Practically every day some new technology is being invented which violates your privacy. The CEO of Sun Microsystems just said the other day that privacy is dead, get over it. I think he's slightly ahead of his time. Because very much like in arms races, just where there are new weapons of attack, there are also new weapons of defense. And technology is not all one-sided at all. One of the most important new privacy-protecting technologies is high-power encryption. Basically, encryption has been around for 4,000 years, but this one is a little special. It allows the people who communicate on the internet, and if you wish on the phone too, complete protection. None of the public authorities who spend billions on this have been able to crack even a single message. And drug lords use it, terrorists use it, pedophiles use it. And I'm not just not saying this for effect. I mean, the guy who blew up the World Trade Center had his group set up to commit another explosion. He wanted to either blow up the United Nations building or one of the tunnels leading to Manhattan. And when they searched his home, they found an encrypted file in his computer with the details of his plans. Should we be able to read that file? The pedophile was found who had all his boy victims encrypted in his computer, and we wanted to find them in order to help them deal with that kind of experience. So here we have, again, on one hand, a very strong privacy protecting procedure. On the other hand, some public needs. And again, I'm not necessarily want to prejudge where we're going to come out. I'm just saying this is the kind of question we need to discuss in my judgment in that matter. People want hyper-privacy. The government tells us that under some conditions they want to be able to read these messages. Where do we come out? Let me add that the only conditions under which we talk about is decoding these messages is under the same conditions where the government is allowed to tap a phone. You have to go to court, you have to give a specific order, you have show cause, otherwise you cannot tap a phone or you should not be able to decode the message. And you may again ask, because I want to speak for a moment for the other side, how could anybody object to that? Just because I talk on the phone, it's okay for the FBI to listen under certain conditions, but if I shift to the other instrument, I communicate or I push a button on my phone and it encrypts, I no longer should be subject to the same law. And that's exactly what they say. They say that we're coming to a new Zion called cyberspace, in which we finally, after all these years in the desert, we're going to come to the utopia. And this place going to be a city not only without walls, but without government, and things will take care of themselves. And so it's a wonderful dream, but what happened out there is while cyberspace might have been a village, it now became a city in which people get mugged, in which commerce intrudes ever more. It becomes ever more by default. I wish I could stop it like the rest of society. And therefore the notion that there is no role for government in cyberspace is really, I don't think, very defensible. If you've seen what happened last week, imagine with the Melissa virus, if the government wouldn't have stopped that virus, how practically everything we do would have come to standstill. So here's a case, again, where I would say, under limited, carefully defined conditions, the government should be able to decode messages. But let me give you as a final case, I have more in the book, where I found the other way. One of the least known facts, surprisingly how known it is your medical records are open game. Most people don't realize that medical privacy is traded on the internet like any other information. The only thing, by the way, one of the very few things in which there's a federal law which prohibits disclosure, is the videotapes you rent. What happened when Bork was up for hearing in 1987, some reporter checked into what videotapes he was renting. Turned out they were rather innocuous ones, but Congress got rather angry and they passed a law protecting the privacy of videotapes. But I have cases where a bank called in loans because their customers had cancer and they were afraid that they were bad risk. We have 206 cases where employers didn't hire people or didn't promote people because they had bad genetic profiles. Dana Shalala came over last week and she talked about that. If you had an abortion, if you take antidepressant, it's all freely traded on the internet. It's not protected by federal law, and states differ immensely how their laws are constructed. By the way, next time you go to a physician or a hospital, or if you want to look at the book, you see the text of the form you sign. And I don't think you ever noticed that what you say is, I'm authorizing the physician to release this information to the health insurance company. But doesn't say what they're not allowed to do with it. And so that's one of the major ways it's troubles. Pharmacies sell information, who buys what drugs and so on and so on. I could not find the redeeming merit for doing this. You see, here, I was asking myself, what's the social purpose? What does it serve? And I thought about improving medical quality, improving cost control, public safety, medical research. But with medical research, there is a problem. But I found that all these public goods could be served quite readily if medical privacy would be much stronger protected. So I went from there to argue that in this case, where privacy is violated, not for any compelling public good, that we need to show it up, and I discussed to some degree how. The most surprising finding for me was that we are so conditioned to think as the force which endangers privacy, as Big Brother, as the government in 1984, that we didn't realize that as we were watching the door, somebody jumped in from the back window. I call them big bucks, or privacy merchants. There are now a large number of corporations whose only line of business is to sell personal information. The credit bureaus, for instance, list brokers, which will tell you who subscribes to what political journal, how vulgar people's taste is, and so on, by Hustler and such. There's no basic information except some limitation on HIV. You cannot buy from some profit-making company. So some companies, that's their only business. And then there are quite a large number for them, this is a sideline. They use it for their own marketing, and they sell what they find to some other places, kind of people collect all this, who together have more information about us now in private hands than the German secret police ever had about East Germans in the communist days. So the major threat to privacy at the moment, it comes from the private sector. I mean, I assume most of you know that when you approach a website, they will put into your hard drive a little surveillance file called cookies, which then keep track on what you are doing. Some of them Amazon will ask you if you mind, but most of them will not. I, as was mentioned, did maybe one book too many, maybe two too many, but it never happened to me before that within 2 days of the publication of the book, I've been as publicly validated as in this case, because it's 2 weeks now that the news came that Microsoft put a secret window in all our windows in which they not only can track what we do, but also basically how we think, because once I know what you do with a new piece of information, how you file it, how you index it, what else you call up, I get a good feel of how you think. 1984 arrived, .com. Where do we go from here? I think we need to rethink our basic legal doctrine of privacy. And basically, when I come out, and that, I'll close on that, I would like to separate the privacy's commitments we have, obligations, law, into two groups, two camps. One dealing with the right to be exempt from scrutiny, what some lawyers call informational privacy, and anchor it straightly in squarely in the Fourth Amendment, and the right to autonomy and the 14th Amendment or some other place. Now that needs explaining. If you go back to the way the right to privacy was created as a constitutional right, it was done around the so-called reproductive right choices. The first case, Griswold, was around the question if a married couple, today that sounds peculiar, if a married couple would be allowed to use contraceptives. And then there are several other cases ending up with Roe versus Wade, we all know about. But the issue which was involved in all those cases has nothing to do with privacy, as we understand it. Privacy throughout history, in all our intuitive standing, in all our writings, in all other cultures, has a fairly clear meaning. It's the right to have a wall around us, or a veil, a curtain, behind which we can do things which people will not be allowed to look. To be exempt from scrutiny, from visibility. The reproductive choice cases deal with a very different question. They deal with the question, who has the right to control the act? The government or the person? It has nothing to do with privacy. It's the pro-life people do not want us to have abortion in public space. That's not what it's about. When we go and buy a can of bean in the supermarket, that's a private choice. We don't mind if the whole world sees it. So the issue of choice, autonomy, very important. And the issue of exempting from scrutiny, very important. But they're very different things. The historical reasons why somebody tried to mix them up together, if you wish, we can go into them later. So, by the way, I'm not the only one who makes this argument. Many of my colleagues, feminist colleagues, make the same point, that this odd concoction, the way privacy was shoehorned into the Constitution, endangers not only our concept of privacy, but also our concept of choice. And they are among those who would like to move the right to choice and anchor it in a different place in the Constitution. What I'm interested in is anchoring the right to be exempt from scrutiny in the Fourth Amendment. Why? And I'll close on it. Because the Fourth Amendment, unlike the First, unlike many others, is not absolutist in its tone, in its phrasing. It doesn't say Congress shall make no law or there be no searches. It says there be no unreasonable searches. And therefore, on the face of it, recognize the category of public interest, of reasonable searches. On the face of it, it is balanced. More than that, better yet, it provides us a mechanism for sorting out when is it reasonable, when it's unreasonable. You have to go to court and get a warrant. Now, it's a very complicated issue because it's an enormous literature of cases on the Fourth Amendment. There are all kind of highly technical issues. I'm not a constitutional professor. Next slide I'll be one, but not in this one. But the one thing I want us to talk about is not the technical details, but the basic concept. Fourth Amendment recognizes that privacy is to be cherished, so is the common good, and asks the question, without privileging a priori either side, how are we going to come to the point of balance? That is what I think we need. Thank you very much.
There will be a reception that you're all invited to in a few minutes. But in the meantime, we thought we'd give you a chance to ask some questions and do Amitai Etzioni's favorite thing, have a little dialogue with you. And I'll let you field the questions, but if I see somebody that's really being overlooked and we know that they're going to leave highly offended, why I might tap you on the shoulder and point that direction before it's all over.
Please.
That the moral voice comes from the community. Could you elaborate upon what you meant by that?
Right. Now, we, of course, if we are brought up right, we have an inner moral voice, or some call it the conscience, or somebody will talk about a superego, depending on what language you prefer. But that, as I suggested, is not adequate. And so we need reinforcement. It's part of our human failing. I mean that seriously. That we are not this autonomous, self-propelling creature. our moral voice tends to decay, our inner moral voice. And therefore, unless our brothers and sisters tell us, cheer us when we do what's right, and chide us when we fall off that course, we are not going to be as good as we could be otherwise. We never can be perfect. It's very important to remember. Now, that invites the question, well, can a community be a community of Nazis? So it's not necessarily, all communities have that voice, but they can use it for some very evil purposes. And that gets us to a very difficult question, which we hear very often discussed on the question of cultural relativism, and should we tell other communities what to do, which in effect raises the moral question, can we judge the merit of the moral basis of cultures of other communities? I'd be happy to go down that road, but I mean, first to tell you that I cannot give you a satisfactory answer before 8 o'clock tonight because it's a long trip. But let me just make a down payment. For those of you who are up on those little terminologies, I'm a deontologist. And what that means in plain English, I believe that there are compelling moral causes who speak to us, to all of us, in an unmistakable voice. Sometimes it gets hidden under the cultural and historical clutter, but when we have moral dialogues, we start to see that light. And so that's why when we open ourselves up and are opened up, we will ultimately all end up ultimately in the same place. And here's an experiment I conducted with, every time I give this talk, with more than 400 different groups of all kinds, including Unitarians, and in different countries, in different places. And, right? And so the question I always ask is this. Imagine for a moment you're a committee for the third grade in school, and you're in charge of the curriculum, and you're supposed to teach children truth-telling is better than lying, or lying is better than truth-telling. It's around the question, you know, if Washington ever told a lie, you know. And without exception so far, maybe today be the first day be different, people look at me as a puzzle. They say, I'm sorry, I don't hear the question. Where's the question? Because we realize immediately that of course we've got to teach children that truth-telling is better, nobler. Let me tell them that there's some exceptions. Somebody's dying from cancer and ask you if there's any hope. It means it's genuinely for the benefit of the other person, not your benefit. We make exceptions. If a Nazi comes and asks you, where are these 10 Jews in the basement, you know, there are exceptions. It is not an absolute thing either. But the starting point is that truth-telling is better than lying. Now, once we understand that, then we go to Kant and all those questions. By the way, I'm not at all sure it's true that if anybody lies, or everybody else will start lying, and the whole thing will unravel. This is sociologically not completely defendable. But the rationalizations come after revelation. And so, and I deliberately use that term. Sense things speak to us, if you wish, in a religious voice, and you wish some other voice, but they're unmistakably compelling. And I would rest my moral case not on consensus. I never use the word consensus. Consensus is a political concept. A community can agree 100% to be wrong, I mean, from my viewpoint. But I need this external point to be able to judge communities. But that, I would appreciate if we're not turning into a seminar on that, because that's going to take far away from privacy. But here's another piece of evidence. I don't think anybody in this room who thinks privacy is evil. Why? You see, we didn't go through a 6-hour seminar asking why is privacy is good. We understand immediately. Then we can think about why a free society needs privacy and so on and so on. And you say, well, what about Japanese, you know? I have not found yet anybody there who, after we talk for a little while, you know, cannot see the merits of the both sides of the equation. I think then we have to start to point at people instead of talking to all.
I'm curious about the technological creep of
They go.
of the privacy. That's right. Speaking of creep, creeping into me here. You mentioned smart passes for driving through tolls, and and of course shopping cards that print out coupons for you that you enjoy, cookies on the internet. All those things are ostensibly designed to facilitate money making for the business and the ease of use for the customer. I'm curious whether that's an entirely technologically driven phenomenon, or whether that type of event you might be able to pick out 200 years ago or 50 years ago in some other fashion. Whether newspapers have always sold lists of subscribers, whether or not businesses have always found it in their best interest to do that type of activity. I guess it's a historical question.
Well, I think you're right in saying that there have been always a violation of privacy, and that there was, at least for a long time, and not always, not every place, a fairly extensive sector of profit-making people. That's kind of, I think, largely part of modern life, which were using the best devices they could to make money. What is new here is the high-power computers and the speed of light in which all this flies around the world, and how we can get such a comprehensive picture on you, and that we no longer draw the line at your consumer tastes, but we go beyond that to everything about you, so to the point that unless you revert to some of the countermeasures, you have very, very little privacy left. So the totality of it and the effectiveness of it is new. And let me say, there's a whole other generation of technologies coming down the block, like biometrics, which going farther strip our privacy away. So I think the scope of it is, I think, new.
Do you think that this move toward, do you think that this efficiency that's being sought in the market by using these technologies is a bad thing? Personally, your personal opinion, is that something that you feel has any moral value at all, negative or positive?
And I feel we need to introduce balance in the private sector too. So surely making money is not evil on the face of it, and making some of the corporations argue they're going to limit the kind of junk mail we get, because we're going to get targeted junk mail rather than regular junk mail. Though if you ever had your screen spammed, most of us don't enjoy that too much. But the question again is, what's on the other side? So to the degree that we get some annoying junk mail, again, there are counter devices now. AOL allows me to block the account from such stuff, and there are other things. We can buy now programs which will kick out the cookies. So there, I don't think we should get heart attacks and go to the barricades for this issue. But when it comes to your medical privacy, I think we have a problem. I think when we lose our loans and our jobs because of that, without any recourse, and nobody tells us why, we have a very serious problem. And then we come to something which, in fact, I have today an op-ed of the page of the New York Times, an article about, which I find a very tantalizing issue. The problem is that the computers can move from your on-face public facts very quickly to your very private facts. So, for instance, just to give one example, insurance companies in some states are not allowed to ask you about your sexual orientation, which they like to know, because if they think you are prone to have HIV, they rather not insure you and insure people who are less risky. They're not allowed to ask you, but they just ask you if you're 40 and married and have children, if you live in Castro in the Village, if you're a designer or librarian, and then they take a half a dozen such facts, reflect prejudice in their own, but out of this they make a correlation which suffices for them. A particularly revealing story is of somebody who for 20 years was shopping in one of those clubs where you get discounts, and they had a card, and he fell on actually a puddle of yogurt, and he damaged his knee, and then he brought suit against the shop, and the shop said to him, "Go ahead, make our day. We'll show the court that you bought a lot of liquor, you must have been drunk." Now you see, that person didn't dream that when he was shopping there for 20 years and letting them know, what yogurt he buys, that one day is going to be used against him. I had my genetic test done, And John Hopkins spent half the time explaining to me the mathematics of the genetic laws, the other half time warning me that if I didn't pay cash, it's going to go into my record and it's going to haunt me for the rest of my life. And so there are very few innocent facts. And so the question will be, how can we balance commerce, which has its place, without them being able to use that to spill over into all aspects of our life?
You made a distinction between issues of freedom and autonomy and issues of privacy. And you were also using the language of conscience. And I'm wondering, it seems to me that some scholars would say that conscience, the concept of conscience has arisen out of a development moving away from moving away from shame to guilt, where shame is associated with societal external shame, and then guilt is more of an interiorization of that. But I'm wondering if the idea of respecting another person's conscience or respecting one's own conscience should be placed in issues of freedom and autonomy rather than in discourse about privacy. And how would you respond to that?
Well, it's a very good question, and it may apply to both. The fact that I like to separate them doesn't mean there's nothing which will impinge on both of them, though maybe differently. But the issue of shaming is a very important one to our dialogue here. And again, our first reaction is, shaming somebody, it aggravates them, it may hurt their self-esteem, it rather should come from inside, though there are also people who don't like guilt either. But it's opening them up to public scrutiny and criticism. And then it comes to the question, compared to what? If the person is not engaging in behavior which is damaging to others, then we should neither shame them nor do anything else with them. But let's assume for a moment somebody did engage something we agree is not virtuous. And it's important for the conversation. We have to agree that something which offends our serious values, Let me take an example that's a real one, of an accountant who embezzled accounts people gave him to take care of. I think most of us agree that we can just shrug our shoulders and say, let's leave it to his conscience. So now I give you two alternatives. We can send him for jail for a week, or the judge gave him the option of carrying a sign in his neighborhood, big sign saying, I'm an embezzler. And by the way, when he was interviewed doing that, he said, next time I'll go to jail. In many ways, and I mean this in all seriousness, so it takes a moment maybe to see what I see here, I'd much rather have him shamed than put in jail. First of all, I have news for you. A middle-class person in jail, he already is shamed. So there he's get shaming end. Second, if he's young in our jails, he may be open to gang rape. He may be subject to violence. The public costs are huge, and the rehabilitation is nil. So here, you see, shaming compared to what? Compared to do nothing? I don't think we would like in this case to shrug our shoulders. Compared to jail sentence, especially for young and first-time offenders, I would think that shaming is exactly the kind of tool I'm talking about, where you activate the juices of the community. It's a relatively light penalty, as painful as it is. And finally, it has another, I'm sure I sound like I kind of sing the songs of shaming, but let me tell you, it has one other quality which is surprisingly attractive. It's completely democratic. You cannot shame somebody if their community doesn't share the values you're shaming them with. So if you take people in certain part of our cities and you try to shame them by sending them to jail, and it turns out that for that part of the community, that's a badge of honor, you're not going to shame them that way. So shaming assumes that there's something in their person and in their community you can speak to. So as much as I would like to live in a world where we never have to shame or jail anybody, if we do have to punish them, first-time offenders, non-violent offenses, I would prefer shaming over most alternatives. Now, some people deliberately confuse shaming with something completely different. When you spank people in public, or flog them, or put them in stockades, but that's not shaming. That's shaming plus something else, So I certainly have trouble with that something else. But that's violence and not shaming. I don't know. Let me go.
If I understood you rightly in introducing your talk by the set of contrasts among individualists, conservatives, and communitarians, your point there was that the two positions on the extreme don't allow the kind of thinking about privacy you want to engage in because they rigidly answer the question. One by saying privacy should never be compromised or something close to that, and the other by defining its compromises in terms of a rigid set of moral rules, the conservatives. The communitarian position then understands that there are a number of values to be balanced and therefore is most consistent with the Fourth Amendment's notion that there can be reasonable invasions of privacy. What I wasn't so clear about is how we think about those invasions when there are a number of values at stake. Granted, you gave us some rules, but they were on the whole rules for trying to avoid the conflict of values by finding a solution where all of the values could be affirmed. When you do have a number of values at stake, then how do we think about what sorts of principles do we bring to the balancing of these several values? Balance itself begs for another principle.
Yes, it does.
And that's the one that I didn't hear.
No, I completely agree. Let me just slightly kind of clean up. Over here on the fundamentalist side, I'm not sure all social conservatives will want to sign up them, but I would sign up some of them, is not simply a notion that there's a strict, rigid set of rules, but also a willingness to, a quick willingness to use the state to enforce them, and therefore make light of the whole idea there is a private sphere. Now, as to the question of balance, the criteria I use tell you that when you have two values in tension, which one needs to take precedence. So in that sense, it solves the balancing issue. So when you have, in the case of the testing, HIV testing of infants, you on the one hand the privacy of the mother, on the other hand the life of the child, we have a tension here. I would get privilege or privilege long term, give precedent, a priority to the life of the child, and I would diminish privacy here because this analysis told me which one of the contesting sides should get a right of way. And in the case of medical records, I would take the opposite viewpoint. Since I find a violation of privacy on the one hand and no compelling social merit on the other side, I would lean in the opposite direction. So the criteria tell me more than there is an issue, there's a tension, but tell me who should get the right of way.
How do you decide about this ordering of values in terms of priority and posteriority, or in terms of precedence and subsumption under precedence?
Well, I go and look, first of all, if I can find something on both sides at all. So, but maybe the subsequent question is, if I find something on both sides, how big is it? So if the violation of the common good is minimal and the violation of privacy is enormous, I may lean one way, even when there are things on both sides, or when we have people dying on left and right. That's what we call a state of emergency. In Britain, when they were attacked by Hitler, they suspended the constitution. So the enormity of violation on this side or that side come into play. I didn't go into that. It's kind of a second order criteria. Now, then we can go into the small print. One of the kind of taxing issues is, how do you count bodies against property? What if there's not a lot of bodies, but there's a lot of property destroyed? Well, it wouldn't upset me that much. But anyhow, there are all kind of secondary and tertiary accounting schemes would have to come in. But I'm really just trying to get to the first base. So as long as I could get people to accept, A, that we need balancing, and B, that we need to be concerned not only with privacy and also the common good. I'll leave to the rest young people to there's much more needs to be done, but that's the way I would go.
Let's take a couple more questions and then invite you to come downstairs for a glass of whatever. and continue the conversation there. Unfortunately, there's a schedule today, and Amitai has other things to do later on this evening. So a couple more questions, okay?
Thank you.
If I understood you correctly, you're advocating moral fiber based on embarrassment for not having it. And I think that the press has taken it upon themselves to be that body in our culture which wants to inform us when somebody doesn't have moral fiber. And the question I have for you is, whose job is it to interpret the data that the press comes up with? Does it belong to the people at large or to legislators? I was very surprised to see the extent to which public opinion polls were used in the Clinton ordeal. And I'd like for you to comment on that.
All right. It's a fairly important question. Going back to the question is not only whose job it is, but what criteria we bring to bear. So first of all, as a kind of a very early first cut, the analog to gossip is very useful here. If you live in a small community and people gossip all the time, or sociologists call this informal communication, which is it's gossip cleaned up. By the way, it helps us to remember there's also positive gossip. And people talk all the time about good and bad deeds people do. Now, how do we know, how do we handle that? We, first of all, look compared to our values. Do we care? One of the interesting things for me was that we used to think that divorce disqualifies you for the presidency, for being a speaker and such. And we, as a community, changed our mind about that. And we now had a conversation about adultery and lying. And we again said we don't like it, but we don't think it's impeachable. Again, not all of us, but a large number of us. I think, just to show you, that doesn't mean that anything goes, as some people argue. I'm going to change one detail. It would have one tiny detail. Everything else is the same. And the conversation would be over in 5 minutes. Assume Paula Jones is 12 and Monica is 13. The only question is, would he leave in the morning or afternoon? And so why? Why is that so obvious to us? Because there it would tap into a different kind of value in which we said that's bumps off everything else. So first of all, what we do when we hear this as individuals and as communities, we have inside us and shared among us certain moral understandings, and we compare that information to those. Sometimes we're not clear about it till we have the kind of conversation we had last year. Okay, so that's the first step. Now, the second is we still need to ask ourselves and each other then, so we all agree, did we agree for the right thing? We're not always, when we all agree, or most of us agree, come out the right place. And then we come back, we have to fall back, in my judgment, on some external criteria. For some of us it's religion, for some of us it's what Sandy calls the constitutional faith, some of us have a civic culture. But we need to find in the end some external basis which justifies our judgment. But as first approximation, we go through these processes. If you examine as a sociologist what happened last year, it was nothing but the question, what were the facts and what they mean? But despite the fact it looked like we were screaming at each other all the time, in the end there was a fairly close shared understanding what happened and what conclusions we're going to draw upon it. That's the way the village works. It's not a perfect consensus, but there is a voice of the people which does arise. You get the last question.
You alluded to this in your response to Professor Gamwell, but you talked about some sort of accounting structure that's needed. And I wonder, it sounds to me from what you said that in making an argument for invading privacy, you'd have to make some kind of utilitarian argument. And you talked a lot about public health, public safety, statistics play a big role here. And I wonder if that kind of language, that kind of moral language, in your opinion, which quickly takes on a kind of cost-benefit, tone and appeals to the quintessential rational chooser, if that moral language doesn't impoverish some of the values that are at stake.
I couldn't agree with you more. I'm going to delay the proceeding by a quick minute and to tell you a story to underscore your point. I paid for my sins by teaching ethics at the Harvard Business School. By the way, some of you may have noted I wasn't completely successful either. One of the big crises which occurred there during my tenure was they teach cases, and there's a case about Braniff Airline, and Braniff was close to bankruptcy, and one of the big customers called and said, are you going to be still in business 5 months from now? I want to buy a lot of tickets. And the CEO said, I'm not sure. And the class was aghast. They made a cost-benefit analysis, or actually calculus of harm, it's called by some other people, and they concluded that he might have damaged the stockholders, the bondholders, the customers, and he should have lied. Out of this came a big to-do, a one-year faculty seminar on the question, should he have lied or not? I was one of the only two who held out and said, lying is not acceptable unless there's some very compelling reason. There was none here. He could have said, I want to tell you, we'll do our best, but he should not have lied. So that's a long way of saying I couldn't give you more. So my starting point is that there are two non-negotiable values, which is privacy, which is deontological. It speaks to us unmistakably. And let's say the well-being of children. And that's not cost-benefit, whatever. No. Now, when there is no contrast between them, then one of them should take precedent. When it's a contrast, or when there's a contrast between life and privacy, life will take precedent. And it's not a question if it costs $1,000 or $10,000 and so on. Now, but when you come to a situation which are more intricate, and where you have a relatively, on the face of it, a relatively small violation of the common good, and a relatively gross violation of privacy, then some secondary criteria come in, and even they are not necessarily utilitarian. So, for instance, why do I say that life takes precedent over limb over property? That's not based on a cost-benefit analysis. That's based on a set of values which we all, is in our total legal tradition, our total ethical tradition. That's the way we rank values, and not on the basis of some kind of a utilitarian analysis. So once we go down that road and we exhausted all the remedies, we can get from this, yes, cost will enter. So for instance, in the case of HIV testing, the fact that we have the blood in the lab anyhow, and testing it costs next to nothing, is a consideration number 6. But I would never want to lead with a utilitarian judgment. And thank you for allowing me to close on that call.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let me just have the last word on this very issue. I might say you've heard Amitai say that he is a kind of deontologist, an unusual thing for a sociologist to say. There's another phrase that sometimes I think he uses. He refers to himself sometimes as a neo-functionalist. I think I've seen that. In an article that I wrote on Amitai this summer, when I had a chance to review a lot of his work, I called him a deontological functionalist, meaning that within certain deontological constraints, he will think about more and less, and qualitative issues and quantitative issues that sometimes look utilitarian, but they're always bounded. And we know that Habermas is a kind of deontologist and a sociologist. Habermas is not the only one, but this is a very different and very distinctive perspective in bringing those two perspectives together. And dialogue brings truth out, and in this case, dialogue brought that truth out. So nice to have the conversation. See you downstairs. Yeah, you can. I will.